Here we are. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Heather Brodbeck. I am the VP of RevOps with Yellowbrick, and we've got an exciting topic today and some great panelists to discuss with us. So we'll be talking about a multi-cloud approach to minimize concentration risk. So I'll introduce our panelists here first. So first we have Mark Cusack. He's our CTO at Yellowbrick. He'll share insights of his 20 plus years experience in the data warehousing industry. And Umair Wahid, who's our VP of Product Marketing, also 20 plus years of experience helping organizations build data warehouse and analytics solutions. So also, you can submit questions as we go. And when we get to the end, we can try to field some of those for you if we don't get them answered throughout. So I think we will go ahead and just get started. So Mark, we'll kick it over to you first. Can you just give us a simple explanation for the group on the concept of cloud concentration risk?
Absolutely, Heather. Well, cloud concentration risk really refers to an over-reliance on a technology from a single cloud provider, or in fact, a single SaaS vendor as well. And because deploying a single solution in one cloud can kind of lead to single points of failure and reduce system availability. And if you look at over 2021, both AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, as well as SaaS providers that put all their eggs in one cloud provider basket, suffered outages. And this really had an impact on their customers' ability to do business.
Great, thanks. And Umair, could you add maybe just some insights in like what sectors are maybe most concerned with this type of risk?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, cloud concentration risk applies to any sector that has sort of national infrastructure or some sort of criticality. But right now, the focus is very much coming from the regulators in the financial services sector. So SEC, FINRA, the UK financial services authorities are really kind of leaning in on this topic right now, getting slightly worried about what the dangers are of over-reliance, as Mark said, on a single cloud or a single vendor.
Okay, great. So maybe you can give us a little more specifics about that then. So when we talk about risk factors with a single cloud provider, can you maybe give some examples, maybe some focus in financial services where I think we've all seen some of these risks come to fruition? And either one of you, Mark or Umair, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in first. I mean, I think cloud concentration risk from a financial services perspective is particularly concerning, not only if a single organization, a single bank puts all of their critical analytics and operational infrastructure in one cloud provider, but there's a broader systemic risk to the financial system if all financial services institutions put all of their services in a single cloud provider as well. You can think about the risk to critical clearing, settlement, and payment systems if all of these banks are using the same cloud native services, for example.
Yeah, you can imagine what would happen if people can execute trades and settle trades, or we've seen situations in past years where at Christmas time people couldn't receive their paychecks on time or couldn't process payments, and that obviously leads to a lot of pain for individuals. But as a whole, imagine if businesses couldn't pay each other for a period of time, that would cause all sorts of contract disruptions and disruptions in the market and supply chain. And really impact the way that businesses operate or don't operate. But there are also sort of regulatory concerns as well in terms of just needing to be compliant.
Yeah, I'd also add there's, I think, another risk as well about the buildup of data over time in a single cloud provider. And that makes it harder to move away. Even if you wanted to, there's a certain amount of inertia that builds up as your systems and infrastructure and data estate grows in one cloud provider. And I think you enter into this kind of vicious cycle where the ecosystem gets increasingly entrenched with a particular cloud provider, and it becomes difficult to make and de-risk decisions moving forward as well.
Okay, great. So maybe just to build on some of that regulatory piece. So maybe just briefly explain the importance of compliance and maybe some of what is the engagement or what does that look like between cloud providers and regulators and really what's expected of companies going forward with this?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think regulators are concerned about today is also the transparency of the technology and the stacks and the processes and organizational makeup of banks that deploy their infrastructure purely in one cloud provider. There's potentially a lack of transparency. It's more difficult for regulators to go in and do the auditing that they need to ensure that banks' critical systems are going to remain online and available to process all of these critical tasks that Umair referred to earlier.
Yeah, and the regulators have put the onus on financial services institutions to prove that they're able to operate in the most difficult of circumstances, and that includes when cloud services potentially down. So financial services were late to the party in terms of adopting cloud services because of some of these risks and the lack of control that you have. It's not your service. You're relying on multiple layers of services provided by these operators. It could be the simplest misconfiguration in the cloud that causes a massive cascade of outages to other services, and it might only be a fraction of a 10-15 minute outage. It might be a 10-12 hour outage, but the knock-on impacts of that are huge. And we've already seen examples of institutions that have been fined by their regulatory authorities for not being able to deliver compliance reporting on time. So, and as a result of some of these impacts of some of these systems not being available. So, and those fines can run into millions of pounds as well, millions of dollars. So, some major impacts of not being able to report, liquidity positions or standard compliance reports, some compliance submissions that organizations are required to submit to their regulator.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that as well, I think I was speaking with one New York-based bank quite recently who was telling me that the Federal Reserve Bank and the New York Department of Financial Services are recommending that it's best practice to follow a multi-cloud approach to avoid these kinds of issues. But what's also really interesting is this bank believes that within the next 2 to 3 years, this is going to become a mandate from regulators, that it's not just a recommendation. You will be required to take a multi-cloud approach to how you support these critical infrastructure systems.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's a good lead into the next question I have here. So now that we understand the risk and what it's about, so how do companies avoid that risk, and what's the best approach that they should be taking forward with it?
Yeah, and I think, if I think about how they can start to avoid this risk, they obviously need to take a multi-cloud approach from the start, which actually can be very difficult because often, as I mentioned earlier, banks get entrenched in a particular cloud provider, but they also need to start to think about how they can broaden their solutions and take advantage of similar technology stacks that are available in different public clouds. One of the big difficulties is in avoiding these risks is getting locked into a particular technology stack or way of doing things with a particular cloud vendor. And so what you really need to look at is how you can take advantage of the same skill sets you have in your business today and the same technologies in the broader ecosystem that work the same way on different clouds, so you can help to reduce this risk. So rather than getting locked in one technology stack or one provider, look at, I would say, third-party providers that provide the same features and functionality and capabilities that can support your needs on all clouds. You're going to reduce the barrier for migrating and using all of these different cloud providers.
Okay, great, thanks. So maybe, for me in my past life working at a bank, one of the things that I was always concerned with was the cost element of this, right? And what does that look like going forward? And when we start talking multi-cloud, to me, it sounds almost like building cost, right? So can you guys talk a little bit about like what that cost looks like as we think about multi-cloud?
Yeah, and I think we've got a little graphic which kind of in sort of second grader math kind of talks about this stuff. I know Heather's like itching for where's the spreadsheet? Where's the data behind it? This is just a really simplified example of some conversations we've had with a particular customer where they had a particular run rate in the cloud in terms of on premises of their analytics solution. In this case, we put it down to 7.5 million. Obviously, these numbers aren't real, but in the right ballpark. And they moved that service out to the cloud. now costing them $5 million a year. Great, right? They've had a $2.5 million saving year on year. So and that's going to go ongoing. And now, late in the game, they're having to consider this multi-cloud approach. And at the very least, they're going to be doubling up on their costs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so they've gone from 5 million in the cloud potentially to 10 million across 2 clouds. And so they've really wiped out, reversed that saving. And it's a major challenge. And that doubling of cost is kind of an underestimate, I think, actually, when you think about running and managing 2 different services. And if you lean on some of the cloud native capabilities in each of these providers, they're completely different solutions, require completely different management. So that's probably more than double, because you're having to rethink and then put in layers on top to harmonize and make sure things are working. And of course, test it all, make sure it's all working, because none of those vendors are working together. You're going to have to pull that together yourself. And one of the things that we do with Yellowbrick, and I think Mark's touched on this a little bit, is that we have the same solution that operates in multiple clouds. So it's exactly the same service that runs in Azure, and as runs in GCP, as runs in Amazon Web Services. So we are a more efficient solution, which results in sort of overall sort of lower costs. But when you're doubling up, actually, the effort required to do that is particularly low. So even if your run cost is doubled, and I think again that's probably an overestimate, because there are ways to optimize that. Then you can run the same service anywhere in both locations with low effort, and really maintain some of those cloud savings, not lose them. So part of this is around what Mark was saying around planning for cloud. If you plan for it, that's great. But if you haven't planned for it, then you need to think about what are you going to do in this space, and try and maintain those savings that you've gained by moving to the cloud. Talking to us is obviously one way to do that.
And just to add to that, obviously, Yellowbrick provides a data warehousing solution that, as Umair says, kind of runs the same in all of these different clouds and even on-prem. But of course, I think it's a broader problem than just data warehousing itself. You have to look at the broader analytical ecosystem and the costs and challenges with expanding and broadening up. And many banks today in financial services are, in some cases, on an early journey to the cloud. They have on-premises data warehousing that they're interested in modernizing as well. And there's a broader ecosystem around that of data integration tasks, of legacy data pipelines that are feeding data warehouses, and downstream business intelligence tooling and reporting that's feeding off, and other applications that are feeding off that entire chain. And so one of the things I think that's important is also, how can I move to the cloud or move to multi-cloud without massively disrupting all of this sort of connective tissue around my data warehouse and around my core data estate as well? And so I think it really does pay to look for third-party vendors, again, not just in the data warehousing environment, but in the broader ecosystem that run the same on every cloud and even on-prem, because you're really helping to reduce your risk and not doing a kind of boil the ocean exercise of trying to integrate and provide the same level of services at the same time to everywhere. You can do it piecemeal, in a piecemeal way, at a much lower risk. And
I think there's an element of control there as well. When you're absolutely right, Mark, just to talk about the fact that cloud concentration risk is a broader topic than data warehousing and analytics. When you're talking about virtual machines where you're installing software and you're kind of more in control of the domain, it's almost easier to manage that risk. When the great thing about the cloud is these managed platforms, these SaaS solutions and PaaS solutions, which save you the effort of management and give you that agility. Those cloud benefits of elastic scale and all the goodness there of not having to manage anything, manage as little as possible. But when you are using one of those platforms, there is an element of loss of control. So you're not in control of what those guys are doing, what software they're using, the protections. Great, you can audit them, and you can I'm sure we can all of them have processes where you can go in and really get deep into their operational practices. But technologies like Yellowbrick that are built to deploy across multi-cloud, that give you that transparency, with everything on your side of the fence, effectively, with no Yellowbrick layer between yourself and your data, actually provide a differentiated capability, I think, for data warehousing analytics, specifically around cloud concentration risk.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits or new use cases that are opened up with the multi-cloud option that organizations may not have today.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about the challenges and the risks associated with it, but there is opportunity there too. And I think you look at the ability to start to factor in data sovereignty, governance, latency requirements, that maybe it makes sense to have data within a certain cloud provider, and not to mention the cloud providers themselves provide different native services that some may be better at doing than others. And you might start to build up a best of breed multi-cloud capability by combining services across different cloud providers that you couldn't do before. And that actually could provide some level of competitive advantage. You might be using the Azure Data Factory for some of your pipelining and job orchestration sides of things, but then you might want to use SageMaker for machine learning or Glue for some of the cataloging side of things. And so you can start to build up an idea of how you can combine these things together to get more value out of them. And kind of another area I think is really of interest as well is starting to think about how you can integrate data across different cloud providers. So to give you an example with Yellowbrick, you could have some capabilities, some applications running on Yellowbrick on AWS, integrated with some capabilities running on Yellowbrick in Azure. And you might want to do that for data sovereignty reasons, but you can start to federate that data together, replicate between these two instances. So you not only have resilience and availability, but you can choose to provide low latency access to applications in one case, granular access to data in a particular geographic region, but then aggregate access across regions and so on and so forth. So I think there are value added ways of combining data that you couldn't do before without a multi-cloud strategy.
Yeah, and I think multi-cloud is going to become even more important as those different cloud service providers start to innovate in different areas, and you're going to want to be part of some of these ecosystems that are cloud specific. So the traditional one has been Google has been great at Google Analytics and the marketing advertising ecosystem and reporting around that. Amazon has a financial services data product. Azure's been doing a lot of work around genomics and healthcare and life sciences. So whatever industry you're in, you kind of want to be part of multiple different ecosystems that are growing on each of these cloud vendors that are providing higher value-added levels of service. So yeah, I think multi-cloud for a number of reasons is going to be the way forward in the future.
Okay, great, thanks. And I know we touched on this a little bit before, and I'll just remind everybody, if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll have a queue for that if we want to go over those. But, one of the things that, like in my past work, was always something I was thinking about was whenever we're going to make a big shift or change in our infrastructure, it was really about like, how do we get started? And I think, the places I've worked, and I think this is true for a lot of places, you almost boil the ocean because you want to take everything into account as you do that upfront planning. And, working at Yellowbrick and, being on some of our calls with our customers with Mark, and learning, what their challenges are and how they're thinking about it. I've learned a lot about this more like start small and expand approach, which I think is the most really like low risk way to go about it. Obviously, you want to have the broader understanding of what your end goal is. But Mark, maybe you could talk a little bit about, like how do organizations get started with this? Because I've learned a lot, honestly, listening to you on calls with different customers of ours. So.
Well, I think it's part of it is good old fashioned program management and project management around it, around identifying what are your priorities here, what are the most critical applications and infrastructure that you need to provide multi-cloud access for, and then start to plan kind of the end-to-end 2 or 3 or whatever use cases where you can prove value out of this, and not just taking like you say, a boil the ocean approach to it as well. I think that's probably one of the standout areas for me. But what I find is really interesting talking to a lot of customers is sometimes you don't have the benefit of starting from a blank piece of paper to go from a single cloud to a multi-cloud perspective. We see a lot of banks that go through acquisitions and have multi-cloud forced on them because another bank that they've acquired runs on AWS and they are an Azure shop, for example. So to some degree, you're forced into that. I remember kind of I used to ask customers years ago, which databases and data warehouses do you have? And the answer from every major bank was, we have all of them. And I think that's where we're going to get to in a multi-cloud stance. Or I've spoken to a very, very large financial provider quite recently that was all in on AWS. They were going to move 50 petabytes of their most important structured data and leave it in AWS. Now they've reverted to, hang on, we need to look at all three clouds and think about how we're going to share and spread the risk there.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you. Well, since we have no questions from the group that's on, I'll just say, if you do have questions in the future, you've got, our contact info here. Feel free to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. I'm happy to further the discussion. So I think just to wrap it up, so learned about what is cloud concentration risk, what is a multi-cloud strategy, and learned a lot from Mark and Umair here on regulatory and compliance requirements, and what's really expected going forward. So thank you all for your time, and yeah, for anybody on here, if you want to reach out to further the conversation, just go ahead and do so. All right, thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye. Bye.